There are different kinds of hunger. There's the kind that comes after skipping lunch because you got busy. The kind where your stomach growls during a meeting and you're mildly annoyed about it. The kind that ends the moment you open your fridge. And then there's the other kind. The kind Nadia knew. The kind that doesn't growl. It just sits. Quietly. Like a stone in the middle of your chest that you carry around so long you forget it's not supposed to be there. Nadia was 27. She had a coat that was one winter too old, a phone with a cracked screen she'd been ignoring for 6 months, and exactly $4.17 in her bank account. Not roughly $4. Not almost 5. $4.17. She knew the number the way you know a scar. Not because you keep checking it, but because it just stays with you. She hadn't always been here. There was a time, not even that long ago, when she had a small apartment with a window that faced east, which meant every morning the sun hit her kitchen first, and she thought that was the nicest thing in the world. She had a job at a print shop. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and steady felt like enough. Then the shop closed. Then the rent went up. Then the cousin who co-signed her lease stopped returning calls, and before she could fully understand the sequence of events that led her there, she was sleeping on a pull-out couch in her other cousin's living room, with an eviction notice still folded up in her coat pocket. She hadn't thrown it away. She didn't know why. Maybe because throwing it away felt like pretending it hadn't happened, and Nadia didn't do that. Whatever happened to her, she looked at it. That was the one thing she still had. On a Thursday morning in late September, she took a bus to a farmer's market 3 towns over. The reason she went that far, past 2 closer markets, past the little grocery on 5th that she knew by heart, was simple. She'd heard from someone, somewhere, that vendors at outdoor markets sometimes gave away the bruised fruit and leftover produce at the end of the day rather than haul it back. Not officially, just quietly. If you asked the right way. She told herself this was strategy. And it was. But it was also the only plan she had. The market was set up along the main street of a small town that clearly took this kind of thing seriously. There were hand-painted signs, mason jar arrangements on every table, a woman selling lavender soap who looked like she genuinely loved lavender soap more than most people loved anything, children dragging their parents toward a stall with homemade kettle corn that smelled like it was doing something illegal to the air. Nadia moved through it all like she was invisible. That was another thing she'd gotten good at, not being seen. When you're struggling, really struggling, you learn quickly that being noticed usually just means being pitied. And pity had a way of making her feel worse than the actual problem. So she kept her chin level, her face neutral, and her movements purposeful. She looked like someone who had somewhere to be. She counted the stalls as she walked. 12 in total. She mapped them, not on paper, just in her head, ranking them by likelihood. The big commercial setups probably had rules about this sort of thing. The older vendors who'd been doing this for years were the safer bet. The ones with hand-lettered price tags. The ones who looked like they'd done enough living to understand that sometimes a person just needs something and the paperwork doesn't matter. She wasn't begging. She was clear about that with herself. There is a real difference between begging and asking. Begging says, I have nothing, take pity on me. Asking says, I have a need, and I'm addressing it directly. Nadia was asking. She would ask the right person, at the right moment, in the right tone, and she would not apologize for it. She just hadn't found the right person yet. She moved to the far end of the row, where the market thinned out and the crowd got quieter. That's where she saw the stall. It was the least decorative setup there. No tablecloth, no chalkboard sign with curly lettering, just wooden crates stacked with purpose, jars of honey lined up in size order, bundles of dried herbs hanging from a metal rod across the top, and vegetables arranged with the kind of no-nonsense organization that suggested the person behind them had very little patience for mess. The man behind the table was talking to a customer. She noticed him the way you notice something large and still, the way you notice a tree before you notice what kind of tree it is. He was tall and broad in a way that didn't seem like it was trying to be impressive. He was just built that way, the way some things just are. His beard had some age to it. His flannel shirt had seen better days. His hands, even from a distance, looked like hands that had spent decades actually being used. She waited for the customer to leave. Then she walked up. She kept her voice even, clear. She asked if, at the end of the day, there was anything going for cheap, damaged goods, last pieces, anything he'd otherwise take back with him. She said she understood if not. She did not look away. The man behind the table looked at her, not with the quick, dismissive scan she'd gotten at a couple of the other stalls. He actually looked at her, the way a person looks when they're not deciding whether to feel sorry for you, but when they're actually trying to understand something. He didn't answer right away. He reached into one of the crates, pulled out a peach. It was a good one, round, yellow gold with a blush of red, warm from sitting in the September sun all morning. He held it out to her. "Eat it now," he said. "Not later. Now." She took it, and she ate it right there, standing in front of his table, juice running down her wrist onto her coat sleeve, and she did not apologize for any of it. The man watched her for a second, then pulled an empty crate from behind the table and set it on the ground beside him. "Sit down a minute," he said. Not a question, not a command, just a plain offer from a man who had apparently decided that whatever came next, it was going to involve her sitting down first. Nadia sat. She didn't know it then. She couldn't have. But that was the moment. Not a dramatic one. No music, no lightning. Just a peach, a man, a crate, and a Thursday. That was where everything started. His name was Dale. Dale Rutherford. He said it the same way he said everything. Plainly. Without decoration. Like a man who had never really seen the point of performing himself for other people. He was 58 years old. He had 40 acres in the Blue Ridge foothills, a farmhouse that needed a new roof and kept not getting one, 2 dogs whose names she would learn later, and a way of moving through the world that reminded Nadia of something she couldn't immediately name. It took her a few minutes sitting beside his stall, watching him interact with the last few customers of the morning, before she figured it out. He moved like someone who had never been in a hurry in his life because he had never needed to be. That was a foreign thing to Nadia. She had been in a hurry her whole life, hurrying to finish school, hurrying to find work, hurrying to get stable, hurrying to stay there, hurrying, always, to stay one step ahead of whatever was coming next. Even now, even sitting on a borrowed crate at a stranger's stall eating a peach she hadn't paid for, some part of her brain was already calculating the next move. Dale didn't seem to have that part, or if he did, he'd turned it off years ago and buried it somewhere on those 40 acres. He asked her a few questions. Not nosy ones, practical ones. Where was she coming from? How she'd heard about the market? Whether she had people nearby? She answered carefully at first, the way she always answered strangers, giving just enough to be polite, not enough to be exposed. But Dale had this quality, she noticed, where he didn't push. He'd ask something and then just leave the space open, like he had all the time in the world for whatever she decided to put in it or not put in it. So she found herself, almost without meaning to, giving slightly fuller answers. She told him about the eviction. Not the whole story, not the cousin and the lease and the print shop all at once. Just the shape of it, that she was between places, that things had gotten tight, that she was managing. Dale nodded. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't say it happened to the best of them. He didn't offer her a look that said he was carrying her difficulty for her. He just nodded, like she'd said something reasonable, and moved on. That might sound like nothing, but after weeks of people reacting to her situation with either pity that felt like condescension or discomfort that felt like blame, someone simply nodding and moving on was one of the more dignified things that had happened to her in a long time. The market was winding down. Vendors were starting to pack. The kettle corn woman was breaking down her sign. The lavender soap lady was wrapping things in tissue paper with the care of someone putting a baby to bed. Dale started consolidating his crates. He had a system for it. Everything packed in a specific order, a specific way. Like this was a sequence he'd run so many times it had become its own kind of language. No wasted motion, nothing thrown. Even the bruised and soft produce. The things that hadn't sold. The peaches with marks. The tomatoes starting to give. Were set aside carefully in a separate crate, not discarded. Nadia watched him. Without entirely deciding to, she stood up and started helping. She picked up a crate and matched his stacking system. following the pattern she'd observed without being told. He glanced at her. Didn't say stop. Didn't say thank you either. Just kept going. They worked in silence for about 10 minutes. When the van was mostly loaded, Dale leaned against the bumper and looked at her. You got somewhere to be right now? He asked. Not urgently, she said. He reached into the crate of unsellable produce and pulled out a paper bag. Plain brown, the kind of bag that once held something else, and was now being reused without ceremony. He started filling it. Peaches with soft spots. A bunch of carrots a little past their best. 3 tomatoes that were still perfectly good on the inside. Some dried herbs. A jar of honey that had crystallized. He handed it to her. She looked at the bag, then at him. You're not going to be able to sell any of that anyway, she said. It wasn't an argument. It was just a fact she needed to say out loud, the way she needed to name things to make them real. Correct, he said. She took the bag. Then he said something she didn't expect. He told her he came to this market every first and third Tuesday of the month. He said he usually needed help loading and unloading. It wasn't a big job, couple of hours at most, and that the person who'd been helping him had moved across the state in August. He said he paid cash, day of. He told her the amount. It was fair. More than fair. She looked at him for a moment, trying to figure out what the catch was. That was a habit she'd developed. Not cynicism exactly, just a kind of careful checking, because things that seemed straightforward rarely were, in her experience. His face gave her nothing to analyze. He was just a man making a practical offer to a person he'd just watched load half his van with no instruction and no complaint. Tuesdays, she said. First and third, he said. Okay, she said. That was the whole negotiation. On the bus ride back, the paper bag sitting on her lap, Nadia replayed the afternoon in her head. She did this with most things. Turned them over, looked at them from different sides, checked for what she might have missed. But this one kept coming up clean. A man at a market had given her fruit and offered her a few hours of work. That was all. People did kind things sometimes. It didn't have to mean anything complicated. She ate one of the carrots on the bus. It was sweet in that deep, earthy way that carrots only get when they're grown properly in real soil. Better than anything she'd bought from a grocery store in years. She looked out the window at the hills rolling past. She thought about what he'd said. First and third Tuesdays. She thought, okay, she could do Tuesdays. She didn't think much further than that. That was enough for now. One thing at a time. One Tuesday at a time. And at the end of it, cash in hand, and maybe some bruised fruit to carry home. That was enough. She had no idea it was also a beginning. She showed up the next Tuesday, and the one after that, and the one after that. There's something honest about showing up. It doesn't require explanation or fanfare. You either do it or you don't. Nadia did it. Through the Tuesday where it drizzled the whole morning and her shoes weren't waterproof. Through the one where she was running on 4 hours of sleep. Through the one in October when it got cold faster than expected and she had to keep moving between crates just to stay warm. Dale noticed. He didn't say anything about it. She was starting to understand, just how he worked. He didn't hand out compliments like they were free, but she could tell the difference between a man who hadn't noticed and a man who had noticed and simply chose not to make a performance out of it. The work itself was simple. Help unload the van, set up the stall in the order he liked. Crates first, then jars, then the hanging herbs at the top. Stand nearby during the busy hours in case he needed an extra pair of hands for change-making or carrying. Then pack it all back when the day was done. 2, sometimes 3 hours total. Cash at the end. Always the amount he'd said, sometimes a little more. Never with explanation. She stopped waiting for the catch. It was the driving that changed things. The market was 40 minutes from Dale's farm, and after the third Tuesday, he started letting her ride with him. Not out of pity. He made that clear without words by simply pointing at the passenger seat the way you point at a seat when you want someone to sit in it. The rides were quiet at first. Dale was not a man who talked to fill silence. He seemed to genuinely like silence. He'd have the window cracked even in the cold, and he'd watch the road and the hills and occasionally the birds with the same level of attention, like it all deserved to be looked at. Nadia, who had spent most of her life in apartments and cities and indoor spaces, found herself watching the landscape too. The Blue Ridge in October was something. She'd never really paid attention to it before. Mountains were just background. Things you saw but didn't actually see. But here, in a van that smelled like earth and dried herbs and old wood, with a man who looked at the hills like he was reading something in them, she started actually looking. "You grow everything yourself?" she asked once. About 20 minutes into a ride. "Most of it," he said. "Trade for the rest." "The honey too. Got hives behind the east pasture." She nodded. Then, "How many acres again?" 40. "Use about half." Silence. Then she asked something she hadn't meant to ask out loud. "What do you do with the other half?" He glanced at her. "Nothing yet," he said. She filed that away without knowing why. The conversations didn't come all at once. They came the way things come when no one is forcing them. Slowly, in pieces. Between other things. Dale talked about farming the way most people don't talk about anything, without trying to make it sound more interesting than it was, and somehow making it more interesting because of that. He talked about soil like it was a living thing with moods. About timing. About how the difference between a good harvest and a bad one was sometimes nothing more than 3 days of bad judgment in April. He talked about reading the land, knowing when something was off before you could name what was off. He said, "You spend enough time in the same soil, and eventually it starts telling you things. You just have to get quiet enough to hear it." Nadia listened. She was, it turned out, a very good listener, which made sense, because she'd spent most of her life in situations where listening carefully was how you stayed safe. But this was different. She wasn't listening for danger. She was listening because she was genuinely interested. Because the more Dale talked, the more she felt like she was being handed a map to a country she hadn't known existed. One Tuesday she asked if she could see the farm. Dale shrugged. "Come Saturday." She came Saturday. The farm was not what she expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something picturesque, maybe. Something that matched the farmer's market aesthetic of hand-lettered signs and mason jars. But the farm was just the farm. Working land. Tools in their places. A barn that leaned slightly to the left, and had been leaning that way for 30 years, based on the comfortable way Dale walked past it without a glance. A garden that wasn't beautiful in any decorative sense but was absolutely alive. Green and layered and complicated in a way that took her breath a little. He walked her through it without tour guide energy. Just, this is this, that is that. Here's where the drainage gets tricky. Here's where the light hits longest. Here's what blight looks like in the early stages if you catch it right. Here's the difference between a plant that's dying and one that's just resting. She found herself crouching in the dirt without caring about her jeans. She found herself asking questions she didn't know she had until they were coming out of her mouth. She found herself, for the first time in longer than she could measure, so absorbed in something that she completely forgot to monitor how she looked while she was doing it. Later, driving back to the bus stop, she sat with that feeling and tried to identify it. She'd felt useful before. She'd felt busy before. She'd felt productive, necessary, competent. All those things that feel like enough when you're moving fast enough not to think. But this was something else. This was the particular feeling of wanting to know more about something, not because knowing it would help you survive, but because it was interesting. Because it mattered in its own right. Because the world seemed slightly larger and slightly better once you understood it. She hadn't felt that in years. She stared out the window on the bus home and thought, I want to know how to do this. Not as a strategy. Not because it was practical. Just because she wanted it. She held that thought like it was something fragile. It was a Tuesday in December, when Dale said the thing that changed everything. Not dramatically. Not with any kind of build-up. They were packing the van after market close, same as always, crates going in the same order they always went in. And he said it the way he said most things, like it was a thought he'd had for a while, and had simply reached the point of saying out loud. He told her he'd been thinking. She kept packing. About what? He said he had a half-acre plot on the south end of his property. Hadn't been used in 3 years. Good sun all morning. Decent drainage. Soil that had been resting long enough that it would be ready for proper planting come spring. He wasn't getting to it. There was enough on the rest of the land to keep him occupied, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Nadia slid a crate into the van. Waited. He said he thought she should farm it. She turned around. He explained the arrangement simply. For the first 2 seasons, she'd work the plot, and they'd split whatever it yielded. He'd provide the seeds to start, and show her everything she needed to know. After 2 years, with the paperwork done properly, legally, the land would be transferred to her. Fully. No catch. He said it the same way he offered her the peach back in September. Just, here is a thing. Here it is. She stared at him for a long moment. Then she said no. Not rudely. Not out of stubbornness. She said it the way she said things that she'd already worked out in her head. Clearly, calmly, and with reasons. She told him she had no tools of her own. She told him she had no car, which meant getting out to the farm regularly would be a logistical problem in the winter, worse in bad weather. She told him she had 2 seasons of watching and asking questions behind her, which was not the same as knowing what she was doing. She told him that if she failed, she would have spent 2 years of his land's potential on her own learning curve, and that wasn't fair to him. She told him she had no real safety net. If something went wrong, weather, disease, her own mistakes, there was no cushion. There never had been. And farming without a cushion, real farming, wasn't strategy. It was just another kind of hoping. And hoping had let her down enough times that she'd stopped relying on it. She said all of this looking at him directly, because she wanted him to understand that she wasn't being dismissive. She was being honest. About herself, about her situation, about what was realistic. She finished. The van was quiet. Dale looked at her the way he always looked at her when she said something he was processing, which was to say he looked at her like he was reading something written in a language he was still learning, but slowly starting to get. Then he said, "I didn't ask you if it was going to work." She waited. "I asked if you wanted it." She went home that Tuesday, and she did not cry. She got all the way to her cousin's apartment. She took her coat off. She made tea. She sat at the small table by the window and drank the tea and stared at the wall. Then she cried, not in a dramatic way, not the kind of crying you do when something terrible happens. The other kind. The kind that comes when something good happens and your body doesn't quite know how to process it because good things have been arriving so infrequently that the mechanism for receiving them has gotten a little rusty. Because here was the truth she hadn't said out loud to Dale, and wouldn't say out loud to anyone for a long time. Every reason she'd given him was real, every single one. But underneath those reasons, underneath the practical calculations about tools and transportation and experience, was something else. Something older and quieter and harder to name. She was scared. Not of failing at farming. Not of the work. She wasn't afraid of work. She had never been afraid of work. She was afraid of wanting something this much and being wrong about herself. She was afraid of looking at a piece of land and thinking, I can do this, and then finding out she couldn't. She was afraid that the version of herself who crouched in Dale's garden in October and felt that particular aliveness, the wanting to know, the genuine interest, the sense of the world being larger, was not the real version. That the real version was still just the woman with $4.17 in her account and a folded eviction notice in her coat pocket. It is a specific kind of terror, that one. Wanting something not for survival but for yourself. For the life you could have rather than just the life you could hold together. Most people who've spent enough time just surviving learn to stop wanting things like that. It feels safer not to. You can't be disappointed by a door you never opened. Dale had opened the door, and now she had to decide whether to walk through it or not. She sat with the question for 3 days. On Friday afternoon, she called the number he'd written on the corner of a paper bag back in October, which she'd kept in her coat pocket alongside the eviction notice, without entirely knowing why. He picked up on the 3rd ring, she said. Okay, he said. Saturday work? She said yes. That was it. The whole conversation. She hung up and sat very still for a moment, and the thing she felt was not excitement exactly, or at least, not only excitement. It was the feeling of having crossed a line that you can't uncross. Not in a bad way. In the way that a door closing behind you is also a door closing. It's final, but that finality is also a kind of relief, because there's nothing to deliberate anymore. You're through. The only direction now is forward. She thought about what she would need to learn. She started a list in her head. It was a long list. The length of it didn't frighten her the way she thought it would. She thought about the south end of the property, the way the light hit it. She'd seen it on that first Saturday visit, and hadn't known why it stayed with her. She knew now. She went to bed that night, and for the first time in months, did not run the math on her account before she closed her eyes. She just slept. Spring came, and Nadia put things in the ground. That first season was not easy. No one who tells you a farming story honestly will call the first season easy. There were mornings she drove out to the half-acre in the cold gray light of early April, and stood at the edge of her plot, and could not immediately see what she was doing right or wrong, only that something was being asked of her that she was not yet fully equipped to answer. There were things that died that she thought she'd saved. There was a week in June where the aphids came and she spent 3 full days on her knees with soapy water and a soft cloth working through the rows stem by stem. And she went home at the end of each of those days, so tired she sat on the bus with her eyes open and her mind completely blank, which was actually, she discovered, not the worst feeling she'd ever had. Dale was there when she needed him, and not there when she didn't. That balance, which seemed simple, was something she came to understand was a real skill. Knowing when someone needed help, and when they needed to figure it out themselves, and caring enough to give them whichever one it actually was. He answered questions. He showed her things once, sometimes twice, and then stood back. He never hovered. He never made her feel like she was a project he was managing or a problem he was solving. She was a person working her land next to a person working his, and that was all. The first harvest was not big. It was also not nothing. She loaded her share into her own crates, bought second-hand from a market vendor who was retiring, and she drove them to the Tuesday market in a car she'd borrowed, and she sold out by noon. She sat in the driver's seat of the borrowed car for a while afterward and looked at the cash in her hand. It wasn't life-changing money. It wasn't a solution to every problem she still had, and she still had some. But it was money she had grown. Out of soil and time, and her own hands and a lot of early mornings, and 3 days fighting aphids on her knees. That is a different kind of money from any other kind. She put it in her pocket, and called nobody, and told nobody, and just drove home with it. The second season was better. She knew more. She made different mistakes, fewer of the basic ones, more of the interesting ones, the kind you make when you're trying something you've never tried. She added 2 new crops. She lost one entirely due to poor timing, and accepted the loss without catastrophizing, which was also a skill she was building. At the end of the second season, Lecher did the paperwork. He'd had it prepared with a lawyer in town, a real legal transfer, stamped and signed and filed properly with the county. He handed it to her at his kitchen table one October afternoon with a cup of coffee and the same matter-of-fact expression he used for everything. She looked at the documents, her name, the plot coordinates, the legal description of a half-acre of farmland in the Blue Ridge foothills, hers. She didn't cry this time. She felt something deeper than that, something that sat below the level where tears live. A settling, a shift in some internal arrangement that she couldn't have described precisely, but that she could feel, in her spine and in her chest, like a door finally fitting its frame. She said thank you. He said, you did the work, which was true, and also not the whole truth. And they both knew it, and neither of them said anything more about it, and that was exactly right. 3 years after that Thursday in September, here is what Nadia Osei's life looked like. She had a second-hand truck she'd bought herself, a white one with 140,000 miles that needed a little coaxing in the cold but always started eventually. Her hands were always a little dirty. She'd stopped apologizing for it. She sold at 2 markets now, the original one 3 towns over, and a new one closer to the city that she'd gotten into after her second season. She had a small CSA box program, 14 families who subscribed weekly from April through November, and who she thought of, privately, as her people, even though she'd met most of them only briefly. She was 3 months into running a weekend workshop she called Grow Anyway. It was for women in transitional housing, women in the gap, she sometimes thought of them, the space between where they'd been and where they were trying to get. And the workshop was simple. Here is soil, here is seed, here is what happens when you pay attention. She'd started it with nothing but a borrowed community garden plot and a handwritten flyer, and it had grown the same way everything she'd touched in the last 3 years had grown. Not fast, but real. She and Dale still worked neighboring rows most Saturdays when the season allowed. They still talked in that same intermittent way, in pieces, between things, with long silences that required no filling. He had slowed down a little. She had sped up. Somehow this had brought them to roughly the same pace, which she thought was probably one of the more efficient things she'd witnessed. He had never once said, "I told you so." She had never once given him the kind of thank you that would require him to deflect it, or receive it, or do anything with it. She showed it differently. In the way she kept the south end of the property, in the quality of her work, in the fact that she showed up, still, every first and third Tuesday. Not for the pay now, but because it was Tuesday. And because they had an arrangement. And because some arrangements, when they're right, you simply don't stop. In the small tool shed at the edge of her half-acre, there is a single nail on the south wall. On it hangs a dried peach pit, lacquered with something she'd mixed herself, cracked from drying, still faintly gold in certain light. Visitors to the workshop sometimes notice it and ask what it is. She tells them it's just a peach pit, which is true. She doesn't explain the rest. What it means she can't really reduce to an explanation anyway. It means a Thursday in September. A man who handed her a piece of fruit and told her to eat it now, not later. A crate to sit on. A beginning she didn't recognize as a beginning while it was happening. It means there is a version of your story you cannot write for yourself while you are still just trying to get through the day. Sometimes you need someone to hand you the first word of it, without making a ceremony of it. Someone who doesn't need you to be grateful, or inspiring, or redeemed. Just present. Just willing. She had been willing. She had shown up on the Tuesdays. She had crouched in the dirt. She had said yes when it mattered. And she had grown things in soil that had no idea who she used to be. The ground doesn't care about your past. It only cares about what you put in it, and whether you show up. Nadia had shown up. The rest had grown from there.